Hey everyone, Adam here. Before today's show, I ask you all please to go over to my Instagram and give me a follow at Behind the Life Podcast. I'm also now on Twitter at Behind the Life 3. You can now listen to all episodes on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, TuneIn, and just say, Alexa, play Behind the Life Podcast. Enjoy today's episode. On today's episode, I'm going behind the life of Greg O'Keefe. Greg is a renowned UK sports journalist, currently the Everton Football Club writer for The Athletic. Greg really came to prominence after a hugely successful 12 years at the Liverpool Echo, where he worked his way up from the news desk to being Everton editor. Over the years, he has covered many large stories. Two main ones come to note: the conviction of Michael Shields in Bulgaria in 2005, and the tragic killing of 11-year-old Rhys Jones in 2007. Greg has also made numerous television appearances. He is a hugely successful podcast host, a ghostwriter, and has thousands of social media followers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Behind the Life of Greg O'Keefe. Greg, welcome to the show. How are you?
All right, mate. Not bad.
Good. So you and me have known each other for a lot of years now.
Many years.
And the show Behind the Life, you'll know what the podcast is about. Talk to interesting people who've led interesting lives. So we'll start with your life in a chronological order. So looking back on your life, what you've seen and experienced in journalism, is that something that you wanted to get into when you were at school?
Yeah, actually it was. I was quite lucky in the sense that I knew from a young age that I wanted to be a journalist. And whereas some of my mates at school were, even when right up to sixth form, were like, I've got no idea what I want to do with my life. It literally could be anything. I had that sort of focus that I wanted to work. I wanted to be a sports journalist. And it took a while to get there in the sense of I was a journalist for about 7 years before I got onto the sports desk at the Echo, but I loved it. So yeah, so in order for me to do that, I went to uni and I did a journalism degree, and everything felt quite mapped out in like a career sense. And I remember at the time speaking to my mates who didn't have that sort of sense of certainty about what they wanted to be. I remember feeling quite fortunate because they seemed to feel it was quite a big gap, and they were like they beat themselves up about it, like, why can't I figure out, like some people were going to be going to uni to do law or medicine or accountancy. So I'm glad that I had that sort of path. And even though the industry changed massively whilst I was like just in the sort of starting part of my career, and has continued to change at a ridiculous pace since, I don't regret being in it at all. It's been great.
So what was your inspiration then to get into journalism when you were younger? Was it like remember the old shoots and Match magazines, or what was it?
Yeah, it was stuff like that. Yeah, Roy the Rovers, shoot. My dad's cousin, Steve Hale, was like it was a really well-known football photographer, professional photographer, and he'd take pictures of games. I remember we used to go around to his, and he'd been at World Cups and covered Liverpool winning trophies in the 70s and Everton winning trophies in the 80s. And my dad was interested in obviously sports, like both our dads, and always used to read the Sunday papers and savour some good journalism. And then growing up, I just used to be obsessed with Everton and transfer news and injuries, and I'd be running around to the news agent around the corner from where I lived to try and get the sort of various editions of the Echo, like the late and then the final. And I used to follow journalists like Dave Prentice, who used to cover Everton. He used to do what I later did, and I used to like his writing style. And I suppose you just develop an ambition to follow suit. So that was it, really, mate.
So for those students out there covering or studying media studies, how difficult is it after graduating to actually get into the industry?
Well, I think it's harder now than it was when I got into it. To be fair to students now, I feel for them because on one hand, there's more opportunity because there's so many other website is not just your traditional newspapers, which it was when I started. There's now like online publishers, loads of websites: Sport Bible, Lad Bible, Goal.com, The Athletic, sites like that, which complement the traditional media like the Times, Sunday Times, Mirror, what have you. But the thing is, to make a career for writing for, say, Sport Bible, maybe not as secure a sort of career path as it was when I got a graduate traineeship with the Post and Echo group, which is owned by the Mirror. So there was they plot like a pathway for you. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is there's more opportunities, arguably, but there's a bit less security now because newspapers are effectively dying and the publishers are trying to find new ways of doing things. So another good point, though, for kids who are graduating now is that I think I've noticed there's a lot of younger people coming into the industry and not having to do the traditional route of training and doing media law and doing council journal, learning how to cover the local councils and courts, which was the way I had to do it, learning how to get shorthand. I think now there's been like an equaling out, so there's more people who haven't got degrees as well who are able to get into some form of journalism. So maybe it's a mixed bag. Maybe it's easier in some ways to get into and harder in others to get a sort of sustainable salary from it.
And if we look back at your time at the Echo then, so correct me if I'm wrong on this, the 30th of May 2005, you were on the new desk when you received a phone call about an incident in Bulgaria. Can you just talk through what happened?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It was Michael Shields' dad, Michael Senior. And when you're on a late shift at the Echo, it's usually just you, a late editor and a photographer. So you're just picking up the phone. I mean, the phone, if you can imagine the Echo back in the day, and now, no doubt, but certainly back then, when, well, you think, well, it's made 2005, I don't think there was Twitter. Or if there was, it wasn't widely used. Yeah. So the main way that people would tell us about stories would be to come in to see us, physically ask at reception, can I speak to a journalist? I've got a story. Email or write or phone in. And obviously phoning in was the most common. So this guy phones in and he's really distressed and he kind of wasn't making sense. He was all over the place. But he was talking about his lads being locked up in Bulgaria and he'd been to see Liverpool. And at first I'm thinking like, well, the final was in Istanbul a couple of days ago, so why? And I didn't click that a lot of people went circuitous routes to get to the game to save money. So obviously he'd been to the match and then come back via Golden Sands, which is a resort in Bulgaria. Yeah. They were going to have a cheap holiday, him and his mates. And that's when so he was ringing to tell me that his lad had been arrested and that he was locked up, accused of attacking a barman or a waiter, and it was something that he categorically hadn't done. But he felt that there was quite an unsettling. He felt there was something afoot to kind of stitch his lad up, and he wanted his local newspaper's support in raising the profile of what was going on.
So what happened next then? Did you go over to Bulgaria?
Well, so literally next, I wrote it. Kind of Michael Senior sort of calmed down. We had a good chat about the situation, and I spoke to the editor, and she said, "Yep, we'll do a story on that." And then one story became two stories became three, and we started to get a little bit of traction of interest from Joe Anderson, who was a councillor then before he was the mayor, who felt there was something not right here, and he got involved. Louise Ellman, who was the MP for Riverside, which was Michael's constituency. Louise Ellman, she was a good MP actually. She just recently retired, kind of during the anti-Semitic scandal with the Labour Party. Okay. She got behind Michael, and it got to the point where they thought there was an opportunity to go and interview Michael in Bulgaria, in prison. So that's what we did. So I went out there, and he was locked up. I mean, it was nothing like the prisons over here. It was sort of like quasi-military type setup. So the guards wore like military uniforms. They carried like assault rifles and guns. And in order to get in to see him, I had to say I was a cousin. So we posed as his cousin. It was me, Michael Senior, and one of his uncles, and Michael. So it was a family visit, and I was the cousin in inverted commas, and that was how we did our first interview. And I ended up going out there a couple of times to see him. Not quite as successfully as the first time.
What happened?
But well, the second time, just we tried the same thing, and I got to the sort of security hut at the start of the prison, and this guard with the gun says to me, "Come in here." So I goes in. He says, "You're Greg O'Keefe?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You're Michael's cousin?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "No, you're not." I said, "No, I am." He said, "No, you're not." I said, "No, I am. I'm Michael's cousin." He said, "Right." And he turns the computer around and he Googled loads of articles.
You've not told me this before.
There's all these articles from the Echo with my name on it. He said, "You're a journalist." So I figured the game was up at that point. I didn't fancy trying to keep the charade going too much longer in case I end up getting thrown into Nick as well. So that was the end of that. But I spent some time interviewing people who'd seen the assault that night, trying to find the waiter, Martin Georgiev, who'd been attacked, speaking to friends of his, and, you know, the coverage eventually built up ahead of steam that Jack Straw, who was then the Home Secretary, and various other people got involved. And it was apparent that after a trial, which was a bit of a sham trial, when Michael got convicted and sentenced to 15 years, it was apparent that it had been a miscarriage of justice. And, you know, the campaign of the Echo, because that's what the Echo used to do and still does, but used to do that a lot, was campaign to kind of get things that were perceived as wrongs put right. So the campaign was to get Michael freed, and eventually, thanks to the efforts of like Joe Anderson and Louise Ellman and, you know, the Echo, he did get free.
That's a really good point. So
his family as well, I should say. Mainly it was his dad. His dad was like indefatigable, like everything you can imagine in a fierce Scouse dad. Just wouldn't take no for an answer, wouldn't accept authority telling him, "Look, just suck it up. It might be unfair, but he's locked up now." Just would not accept anything until he got his lad out, and he did.
So that's a really good point. So the Liverpool Echo, compared to all regional papers around the country, you know, even in Sentinel in Stoke, London Standard, down there, regarding movement. So, you know, there's been Hillsborough, and there's a lot of traction by the Echo over there. There was James Bulger, there was Rhys Jones, you know, and obviously this case with Michael Shields. Why has he got such, you know, punch to be able to, you know, take even things to court?
I think the local papers are a reflection of its people, and Liverpool people don't tend to take adversity lying down, so they're not subservient to authority. They question things, and if they feel that there's something that's wrong, they'll say so, and they'll fight for justice, really. And you've seen that on the bigger scale, obviously, with Hillsborough.
Yeah,
what happened there at the the campaign to get justice and to get, although it was soured in a way with the criminal trials, but what they achieved in finding that in the first place, in getting the verdict that those 96 fans were unlawfully killed, was absolutely huge, because they were up against the establishment. And, you know, it was a really, really a fight that they had in some ways had no right to win, and they did. So I think the paper at its best reflects that. It's not just the Echo. I think Newcastle Chronicles, similar. Maybe the Sentinels, you know, the same. The best thing about local papers is when they stick up for the community that they're from. That's when they really earn their corn for me.
So would you say, Greg, you know, in your career, by being on shift that night, by answering that phone, that propelled your career, looking back now?
Yeah, I would say it did, yeah, definitely. It certainly enabled me to cover a story that got a lot of national and international interest. So the experience that I gained from that was invaluable, really. You know, it led me to be able to ghostwrite Michael's book with him. It led me to sit down in a room with Jack Straw and have a briefing, to do things like going abroad to report on news stories and things that up until that point in my career, I only started on the Echo in late the year before, so I was pretty new or pretty much a rookie daily newspaper journalist when that story broke. So I think it's in many ways it was an opportunity. Yeah,
that's a big thing then, being 24, 25 years old, having meetings with Jack Straw. Was that intimidating?
You know what? When I think back, it wasn't as much at the time, really, which was weird. I think it was because we believed so much that what we were doing, there was so much evidence that this lad hadn't committed the assault, and in fact there was a gross miscarriage of justice from what seemed to me, in this case anyway, to be a pretty corrupt justice system, or a justice system which was prone to corruption. So I felt, no, I didn't. Yeah, I go around the houses there, but no, it didn't feel that daunting at the time. It probably felt more daunting later in my career, sitting in front of David Moyes or speaking to Jose Mourinho or people like that. Jack Straw didn't feel that daunting.
So if we then go 2 years later, 22nd of August 2007, 11-year-old Rhys Jones, for people who don't know it was all in the news. Young child in Croxteth, Liverpool, who was shot dead. Were you one of the first reporters on the scene that day?
It was another example of being on the late shift, really, at the Echo. A counsellor rang in to say, I remember it vividly because it was the evenings were still quite light, and I grew up not far at all from the car park where it happened, the pub car park where it happened. So I took the call and he said, someone's been shot. And the assumption was initially, if I'm honest, that it was gangster had been shot by a gangster type thing.
Yeah.
So then I jumped in the car anyway, because the idea then you'd go to the scene, you'd ask people what was going on, you'd try and find out. And I just drove out of town, straight down Islington, past the Grafton, through along West Derby Road, up past the Jolly Millet and down, all the way down to Crocky. And once I got there and got out the car, and so it became apparent that it wasn't by any means like a normal gangland killing. It was something much, much, much worse. And sadly, I think Rhys had not long been moved by the paramedics by the time I got there, so you could still see the blood in the car park. You could still see some of the equipment the paramedics had used to try and carry on keeping him alive. And I remember speaking to this bouncer who'd been trying to help Rhys and trying to save his life, who was just distraught, just absolutely in shock. And that's when it really dawned on me the scale of what had happened.
So how far did you get involved in the story? Were you the lead correspondent?
One of them. There were quite a lot of really talented journalists at the Echo at the time. So a friend of mine, Luke Traynor, did a lot of the coverage as well. The crime reporter Ben Rossington at the time, really good journalist. We all kind of covered it. It was such a big story. It was so many permutations, from the initial investigation to making the arrests, to the prosecution and the court case, and obviously then finally the conviction of Sean Mercer and some others. I did a lot of it, yeah. And probably the most surreal part was being asked to go into a briefing with Merseyside Police because some of the information that I'd been told about potential people involved was deemed to have been information that I needed to share with the investigation team. So me and one of my bosses went to and I had to sit down with Dixie McNeil, who was one of the chief supers involved in it, and basically had to tell them what we knew. before reporting any of it, because it was actually, there's so much information going around that time, and it was deemed that we had to share some of that with them as a priority, which absolutely was the right thing to do.
And would you say, such a young age with the gangsters involved, if you want to call them gangsters, was the right justice served?
I mean, justice was served, I suppose, in the sense that, everyone who was involved in it was convicted and went to prison. But it's difficult to quantify, isn't it? Because that could never bring Rhys back, and any sentence could never have been enough to, justify what they'd done. And some of them are out now, and some of them are, living their lives. Maybe they've got kids, and is that justice? I don't know. I'm not too sure.
So, two really hard-hitting stories there that you've covered during your time. For you as a journalist, how mentally challenging is it? And especially when you're writing a story up, how do you try to remove your personal emotions?
Good question, mate. Well, it depends. If you're trying to do, it depends what type of journalism you're trying to do. If it's something that involves, I'll give you an example. If I was writing a story about arrests or about the night of, if I was writing a news story with the importance being on what happened, the facts, some interesting and relevant quotes, and the latest updates, then there's no room for real human emotion in that. You need to just tell the news in a really concise and easily to read way. But if you're doing, for example, I did a report or a feature piece on the funeral of Rhys, which was at the Anglican Cathedral, and they played the Everton anthem, Z Cars, on an organ, and his body was carried in draped in a blue in a blue sort of sheet, and there was lots of the Everton players were there, and the chief investigating officer was there. At that point, they hadn't arrested the killers, so that was more of a human piece where you're allowed to reflect the emotion of the day that everyone was feeling. So it's different. It just depends what type of piece you need to write. But fundamentally, the best piece of advice I ever got given when you used to have to go and knock on doors, the family of people who've been killed, is that you can't absorb their grief. That's their grief, and you're just there to do your job in a very professional and sensitive manner, and then get on with it. Because if you try to share or absorb the grief of every job that you did, and I think this is like times a million for police officers or paramedics. I'm not equating journalists with that in any way, but it's a similar principle. It's like you can't take every single thing to heart because you'd never be able to go to work.
So then that's really heavy, that's Greg. Does Liverpool Echo, do they offer support for journalists who are on the front line dealing with hard-hitting issues like that?
I don't know what they would do now. I've not worked there for a while. There wasn't that sort of culture when I was there, but I don't think it... Difficult to say, isn't it? I don't think I needed it at the time, and I don't think you do need it, really. That said, it depends what type of journalism you have to do. I mean, some journalists who go like undercover and spend a long, long time on one story, and you do wonder whether or not there should be more counselling or resource to mental health support for journalists. I'd like to hope now, with this day and age when people are less afraid to speak up about things like that, I'd like to hope that is an option at some publishers. But like, for example, I remember speaking to some older journalists who I used to work with who covered the Lockerbie disaster when that plane was shot down, and sort of hundreds of people were killed, and that was traumatic to say the least. People on the night were knocking on doors, and people had just lost people, and it must have been absolutely horrific. And if you go back even further, there were embedded journalists from the Allies in World War II who would go and report on the D-Day landings and stuff like that. So that's like next level in terms of seeing something very traumatic. I don't think I needed that sort of thing, fortunately, but it's a good question, mate, and I'd like to hope now that there is a little bit more of a thought towards that, because everyone's different, aren't they? Like whereas I was fortunate to not really let it bother me too much, other people might be different, mightn't they?
No, I absolutely agree. And then so moving forward, you then moved into sports at the Echo, covering Everton Football Club. How did you get your break into that?
Again, mate, that came just from the from being at the Echo at the right time, really. So the Everton reporter moved and left, and there was a vacancy, and I knew the sports editor. Everyone on the sports desk kind of knew who I was, because you work in the same office as people. So when it came to applying for the job, I thought I had a good chance of getting it, and good enough it did. And that was my first foray into sports, really. And it was very, very different from day one. Very, very different. Like I'd cut my teeth as a news journalist on like hard edge news, crime, the council, local politics, social affairs, and all of a sudden being thrust into the world of football. You might think it would be easier, but in many ways it's not. It's hard and it's challenging in a different way, because although your remit shrinks in a sense, because all you're reporting on is one club, there's so many different challenges that were just new. You're used to being in a role where you can demand, up to a point, you can demand that authorities and organisations acknowledge that they need to speak to you, and that they need to share resource, and they need to release quotes and be upfront and honest. And then you're in a situation where you're covering a club that's a private business, but it's also one of the biggest institutions in your city, and you're trying to take that same approach. Well, we're the Echo. You've got to tell us this. You've got to cooperate with us. And it's a completely different stratosphere. It's like they couldn't really give a fuck. They say, oh yeah, they support the local papers and stuff, but really, it's the power dynamic changes, and all of a sudden, it's more. You have to be a lot more diplomatic in the way you deal with people. The club, players, the executive, staff at the club, from the owner down to the manager and the trainers and stuff like that. So it's really, really different.
Has there ever been any times when you've fell out with a club or pissed any of the players or staff off, and what happened?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, David Moyes was hard work, to be honest, and he would take things. He would be sensitive to newspaper coverage, and if he didn't like it, he'd let you know about it. He'd ban you. Robert Elstone, he was the chief executive of Everton for most of the time I was covering them. I had an up and down relationship with the Echo, and would lose his temper and decide he didn't like coverage, and so he banned. So David Moyes banned me during a pre-season tour to Australia, where I was the only journalist covering Everton.
Were you over there at the time?
I was with them in the same hotel.
What?
And he disliked the headline, which someone else had written back in Liverpool, so much. He told me that I couldn't speak to anyone from the club for a week. So I'd flown all the way out there from the Echo to cover them. And he basically said, persona non grata, go away, you can't speak to anyone. So I was just in Sydney trying to desperately find a way to justify articles. And so, yeah, and then I remember one time Robert Elstone banned me and everyone else on the sports desk, and we ended up covering the game from the main stand. Me, the sports editor, and Dave Prentice, who was the deputy sports editor, that guy I told you about, who kind of, in many ways, was like a bit of a idol to me when I was growing up professionally. We had to sit with our notepads on our laps in the main stand and watch a game and cover it that way. So it's not always been a bed of roses.
So you're over in Sydney. You've been told, you can't talk to the club, you can't talk to any of the players. You must feel pressure on that. Who's the one trying to make the apologies to Everton? Is that coming?
Well, you say I've been told. It's a good question. So the way I got told bears repeating, because very, very quickly, it was the summer before Mikel Arteta left Everton, and he wanted to leave that summer. And he's being linked heavily with Arsenal. David Moyes didn't want him to go and was trying to persuade him not to go. So this was the first week of the tour in Australia. And the media back in the UK were reporting that Arteta wanted to go and Arsenal were heavily linked with him. And at the first press conference in Sydney, before we started, Everton's chief press officer said, look, don't ask. He addressed everyone there, not just me. He said, we're going to bring in David Moyes, but questions about Arteta and his future are not allowed, which is quite routine way that they deal with. Sometimes they'll just say, this topic is off, it's absolutely ruled out, off limits. So they said that, so that was fine. No one asked about it. And I rang in my sports desk, filed a report on what they'd been talking about. Let's say it was, can't wait to take this unique opportunity to spread the Everton brand in Australia, or whatever it was. And the guy who was sub-editing my article said, did you ask about Arteta? And I explained to him, no. So the next day, the headline was, Moyes says blah, blah, blah. And the sub-headline was smaller underneath, but questions over Arteta's future off limits. So David Moyes, the next morning, bounces up to me in the lobby of this hotel in downtown Sydney. Eyes are bulging. What's this? Thrusts this bit of paper in front of me. It's a photocopy of the back page of the Echo. Thought I told you not to report about this. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. This, you got your name on it. I said, well, I didn't write that. We don't write the headlines. Well, I don't care if you wrote it or not. It's got your name on it. Stay away from me and the players for a week. And that was that. So it was quite pressurised, trying to find coverage when effectively there was nothing else that I could add short of what was going on the Everton website. So in the end, Dave Prentice actually, again, had to phone Everton's chairman, Bill Kenwright, who is a friend of his, and sort of like broker a peace deal. So I was allowed to start covering them again. It was a 3-week tour. So after that,
start the tour.
Yeah, 3 weeks, and that was the start of the first week.
So how long did it take to rebuild the bridges with Moyes?
So, with Moyes, I don't know if we ever rebuilt them totally, but it was the bridges were being built and demolished and built and demolished all the time. But we were allowed to cover them again after that first week. So it was a week of scrabbling around Sydney, and then I was allowed back into the fold then for the second leg in Brisbane, and then finishing off in Melbourne.
That's unbelievable. So what's been the biggest story you've covered over years at Everton? The most exciting?
Probably when they got taken over by Farhad Moshiri, because up until then, Everton had always been in the same boat financially. It was the same old story. They were struggling to match the clubs that they were trying to compete with for transfers. They were always scratching to make ends meet. They were always having to sell to buy. And all of a sudden, they got this takeover by a Iranian billionaire, who had the dough to allow them to compete seriously with the big dogs in terms of finances, like Man City, Chelsea, Man United, so on. So his arrival was probably the most important story that I've covered.
And what's he like to interview and speak to?
Never interviewed him. He's never done any interviews with the press since he'd come in. Had a relationship with him of sorts, sort of being in his company, but never a formal interview. He seems like a nice fella, quite quiet, understated. And I'd like to do an interview with him someday, but he's not especially keen on doing media, so we'll see.
So you became eventually editor for the Echo, and then in September 2017, you left the Echo. What made you leave?
I think I'd just been there, a lot longer than I thought I'd ever be in one job. 2005 to 2017, and I just felt like I'd wanted to probably try a new challenge for a while. I don't know about you, mate, but when you've been in a job for 3 or 4 years, most people get itchy feet, some even shorter. So I was ready to move on, and I had an opportunity to move to the BBC Sport in Salford, and thought it was now or never, really.
And how did that go at the BBC when you worked over there?
It was interesting. It was an interesting experience. It was contract work, so I went from the security of having a full, a permanent role at the Echo, quite senior role where, you're part of the furniture, maybe you've got a job for life to an extent, to working as a contractor. So my initial one was 12 months. And then I had a second one. So they renewed my contract, but on a much shorter basis. And then I was finding that the actual role that I was doing wasn't really what I hoped I'd be doing there. So it was kind of in a big pool of reporters doing live sport coverage from the office. So from screens, a bank of desks, and reporting from games on telly, or maybe watching a weightlifting event in Belarus, the International Olympic qualifiers for weightlifting, and then doing 6 paragraphs on that, and then putting it straight on the BBC Sport website. And I think BBC are an absolutely unbelievable organisation, and I've got so much time for them. But the way that role involved covering sport wasn't really what I thought it would be, and I wasn't really very well suited to it anyway. So that came to an end, and I moved to BBC News. I was lucky enough to get a job in mainly Liverpool, really, in Radio Merseyside, but working for the news website. So I was doing Liverpool news for the BBC news website, which was great, but it was only a short-term contract again. So it got to a point where I wanted a bit more job security. And if I was going to do things like buy a house, or move house, I should say, you just needed that security of not always wondering whether your contract would get renewed.
So then you left BBC, as you said. It was a short-term temporary contract, and you went to Liverpool Echo University. So that was your first job in years away from journalism. How did you find
journalism?
Was that my Stoke?
That was fully Stokey. That was really Stokey. Yeah, it was great. I loved it. It wasn't as different as I thought it would be, actually. I was wondering whether it would just be completely like a U-turn, but actually I found that so many of the skills that I had acquired in journalism for sort of 15, 16 years were transferable. And Liverpool Uni is a fantastic university, dead forward thinking, loads going on, and they wanted someone to help build their profile and get them coverage in the national, local, international media. And so first and foremost, you needed to be able to find stories from the university, write them and sell them. When I say sell them, I mean get them into the papers and stuff like that. So it was very journalistic, and I loved it. It was great.
And then come to your most recent role, so The Athletic, a big American media firm, and trying to enter the UK market. How is it working with a firm like that? Because obviously, have they got offices in the UK, or are they based over in the States?
Both. So they're an American company, like you say, mate, and they expanded to the UK for the first time. First time they expanded beyond North America last summer. So they were in Canada and they were in the US, and then they decided to start covering Premier League football. So they've got an office in London, and then they've got teams of journalists throughout the country covering Premier League and some Championship clubs. And so I had the opportunity to go and work for them, back covering Everton again. And it was, in many ways, it was, you could have looked at it and said it was a no-brainer, but I was genuinely that happy, I hope, and that sort of like fulfilled in the environment and the people there, that it wasn't an easy decision. But ultimately, I thought that sort of like frontline journalism, if you like, in terms of covering, proper journalism, was something I wasn't quite finished with deep down. So when I got the opportunity, I had to make a decision, and I decided to get back into it. So that was that. So I've been doing that since start of August.
So what are you excited about in the future in terms of The Athletic and where they're going?
Well, they're really ambitious. They're really forward thinking. They're really supportive of good journalism, long form, quality journalism. They're not tabloidy. They're not trying to push you to spin stories into something they're not. They're a really talented team of editors down in London who've come from, the likes of the Times, the Mail, ESPN, some top people really, and working with them already. So I think made me a better journalist. And before the, obviously what's going on at the moment in terms of coronavirus and the uncertainty, one of the things that was apparent, which is the thing I enjoy most, I would say, from my career, is the opportunity to travel, to see new places, for work. I think that's like an unbelievable blessing, and I've loved doing that. And already since I joined the Athletic, I've been to Germany a couple of times to interview players, and I'd lined up the chance to go to Portugal, and I was hoping to do a few other trips, but obviously that's up in the air for the time being. But I'd like to hope when the world returns to some degree of normality, I'll be able to resume travelling some interesting places to interview people.
So where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? Almost be 50 then.
But I'll still be younger than you, won't I?
You're just 6 months.
Well, significantly. A lot can happen in 6 months.
Do you think you'll still be Athletic, or would you like to go into radio or television?
In 10 years' time, is that the question?
Yeah, maybe Loose Women, or
Well, you tell me about Loose Women, mate. I don't know. I only know Nice Women. It's a good question, mate. It's one of those I've never been very good at answering that sort of question. Where we be in 10 years' time? And maybe that's a fault of mine, not being able to visualise. I'm not really. A lot of people might say, "Well, I'd like to be the editor of the Athletic." I don't think that's what I'd like to be in 10 years' time. I don't think managing a ton of journalists and doing the logistical side of running an organisation is for me. As you well know, as my mate, I've not got the best logistical skills. That's why I have to ring you every other day and say, Adam, right, you're good at logistics. What time bus shall I get to? That's not my strong set. So I think I'd just like to still be doing something that I'm passionate and interested in, but without sounding too cheesy. Something that, is interesting and passionate and enables me to travel and meet cool people, and, still be able to afford a round with you, some of the bars you drink in.
Well, the cheap and cheerful ones, or the nice wine bars.
The nice wine bars.
So looking back now on your career, has there ever been any opportunities you've missed out on and you thought, shit, if I'd have got that would have propelled me?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A couple of things now that when I think back, there was an opportunity to go and join a news agency called Splash that were like a national.
Dodge, Greg.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Splash is like a journalistic term for the front page story. So whatever's on the front page of the tabloid is called the Splash.
Okay.
So if you wrote that story, you'd say, "Oh, I got today's Splash." So I think that's where that came from. And they were based in London, and they expanded massively in the sort of early part of the 2000s to cover entertainment news, really, but in New York and LA. And I got offered an opportunity to go and choose between LA and New York and work for Splash. And I didn't. Now, I can tell you a million reasons why, but basically the truth is I just bottled it. The salary was really low. It was like $10,000 to $12,000 a year. They were paying for your flights, but you were kind of paying for your own accommodation. You could charge mileage, but you'd have to pay some petrol. And I think it was like you work 7 days a week. So at the time, there was loads of reasons why I presented why I wouldn't do it, which were all perfectly reasonable. But when you think back, if it had just gone, fuck it, I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And gone, imagine what it would be like living in LA or New York and and being a journalist, who knows what doors that might have opened. So in a sense, I look back and think, what might have been. And then the other one, again, it was travel. It was the opportunity to go and work for an agency in Abu Dhabi, which then later extended to Dubai. And, could also have led to working for a paper called The National, which was it's like The Guardian, and it's out in the UAE, and it covers Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So I had an opportunity to go and work out there, and decided not to. So they were good opportunities in many ways, mate. And although at the time they weren't for me, I must admit I've looked back in the years past and gone, I wonder what would have happened if I'd have taken the leap.
Yeah, but we all make our paths in life, don't we? And it is what it is, really. So let's move on to the coronavirus, which is everywhere, all over the world. It's a terrible pandemic. It's the biggest incident since World War II. So I just want to cover a few questions and your thoughts on it. First one, was it man-made, or do you believe the sources that it came from the market in Wuhan?
Well, obviously this is just my opinion because there's no definitive journalism or proof of either. But I kind of tend to, me, mate, I'm not a conspiracy theory advocate. I don't think I think skepticism about the official, version of events is healthy. And obviously as a journalist, I do challenge authority. And for example, if you just said to people 5 years ago, there's no way the Russians would interfere in an election in the US or in the Brexit, then obviously you'd have been proven wrong, because it's now emerged that, the chances are the Russians did, sort of try and influence and successfully influence the US election, and, debatable whether or not they had a similar impact on Brexit. But, my opinion is that they might have done. Don't know. So could the coronavirus be man-made? I'm not saying definitely not, but I think it's probably more likely that it wasn't. It was just a virus like SARS and MERS that was just wrong place, wrong time, but was always going to be an issue because of transmission of infectious diseases, because of the live markets that they have in countries like China and Asia, other Asian countries, where animals are kept in ridiculously cramped confines in quite unhealthy conditions, and people, eat some weird and wonderful things and transport them to their homes, and ultimately, like Ebola, with theories about how Ebola started.
And how do you think?
Sadly, the opportunity there is for these viruses to mutate and jump to humans, and then for humans to transmit to other humans.
And how do you think the over here, the British government and Boris Johnson's handled this so far?
I think it's interesting to know. People are saying that they're floundering and that they haven't really got a clear viewpoint. I suspect actually they have, but they've got a very gradual strategy based around reducing hysteria and keeping a lid on mass panic. So rather than do things in sweeping movements, they're trying to do it gradually to let people get their head around the situation as it evolves. And that might be quite sensible. My only concern is I fear they're being a little bit too relaxed with allowing people to make their own minds up about social distancing. And I think if you read what people are saying in Italy and Spain and China, that the best way to reduce the impact of this on a country is to go for quite strict and stringent measures sooner rather than later. And the last thing I want to see is us have our social liberties eroded and to be put into lockdown. But
it's going to happen.
I think it's going to happen. And I wonder if they should have already done it, to be honest. I wonder if they're being a little bit too slow with that. And then, of course, there's issues over testing. I don't think the response has been perfect, but I'd like to hope there's a method behind the way it seems to be quite haphazard.
Greg, I was at that question yesterday. I completely agree with you. And I think Boris Johnson and the government, if they'd have gone into lockdown last week, as you said, there'd have been hysteria, there'd have been probably looting, rioting. What he's done, and again, he's just a spokesperson. He's took advice. It's been staged every day, So on Friday, they closed the pubs, the restaurants. 40 tube stations in London were closed down. So
yeah,
if actually Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of this coming week it goes into lockdown, I think the country will be used to it. And I think that's quite a clever strategy that he's adopted. But what you were saying before, is it too little, too late? How are you finding it?
I find it quite difficult. I live on my own, and so I've been self-isolating for almost a week now. And then because a friend of mine who I spent some time with a week ago, developed symptoms, and then his wife developed symptoms, and then as far as I could gather from trying to find the best course of action, it was necessary for me to self-isolate, even though, touch wood, I haven't developed symptoms. It was necessary for me to self-isolate. So I've been doing that. Like I say, really, it's been quite... Although I essentially work from home with the Athletic, I never work from home. I find places to go, and preferably around people. It doesn't really work well in isolation. I get bored. I'm quite sociable. I like to talk to people, to have a laugh, to get out and about. So, I wouldn't like working at home in a normal environment, but being sort of more or less largely confined to quarters, if you like, is definitely doesn't suit me as a person. I'm sure it doesn't suit most people. And
I agree. Just
the ongoing sort of low-level anxiety, well, not even low-level, but anxiety and uncertainty over what's coming and what the worst this might or may not be. It's difficult to deal with. I think it must be even harder for older people who live alone and haven't got maybe as much access to some of the material out there to make their own minds up. But as you said, mate, it's probably one of the biggest challenges that face this country in a long, long time. Well, the world, I should say, in a long, long time. And certainly in my lifetime, I'm sure in yours, it's unprecedented. So no one knows how to behave or how to react.
How much of an impact on mental health is this going to have? Because it's under massive fucking strain at the moment anyway. And then 1.2 million people are going to get letters this week through the post box from the NHS saying 12 weeks. But I don't know if you saw the press conference earlier on. So Boris Johnson has said they are not allowed out of the house. Going to the garden, no social distancing. 1.2 million of the vulnerable people. How is that going to impact mental health? Because on a personal level, I've worked from home last 4 days and I found it difficult. I really have. How bad do you think it'll affect mental health in this country?
Very badly. To be honest, I think it's going to be a huge challenge for every single one of us. It's not just people who live alone like myself, but people who live with their family, who maybe are normally used to work. Maybe they've got young children. A friend of mine has got a baby girl. He's used to being in the office and coming home and having that routine. When I say baby, it's a toddler. Now he's thrust into having to try and do a high pressure job. He hasn't got an office at home, so he's in the kitchen. His little girl's climbing all over him, and he's trying to do video calls and work on quite complicated stuff. And I think people are just in utter chaos, and he's trying to reconcile seeing his daughter and doing his job and hitting deadlines and meetings and emails. And I just think that alone is going to introduce more stress and challenges to people's lives. But most of all, it'll be the lack of social contact, because I think already fundamentally the one thing that's been driven back home to me is how important other people are. And basically friends and family are the most important and the only thing that people should really care about beyond other people. Obviously, the other thing about this is that everyone's the same. Ultimately, class, politicians, journalists, footballers, people on the streets, we're all in the same boat now. So it should be a leveler. We should be kinder to other people in general. But in terms of your own immediate circle, I would say friends and family are the most important thing now.
Do you think there'll be any positives that will come out of this in the end?
I'd like to hope people are just generally, it does lead people to have a resetting of priorities and maybe move away from the sort of, I mean, if we were doing this podcast 12 months ago, we might be talking about Brexit.
Yeah.
And Brexit caused some very, 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 very deep divides in this country. And I think this country, all countries are best when people have got a common goal, realise what unites them as opposed to what divides them. And when you think about World War II, the response of British people in the Blitz, the spirit that they managed to engender, to support and stiff upper lip and carrying on regardless when, homes are getting bombed, people are getting killed, loved ones are away fighting, being killed. That sort of spirit of togetherness evaporated. This country was absolutely toxic. People were openly, if you're a Brexiteer, you were scum. If you're a Tory, you were scum. If you're a Labour, you were anti-Semite. If you were against Brexit, you're an idiot. For Brexit, you're a fascist. People were really, really, really turning on each other. And if anything, this might make us all realise that what we've got in common unites us a lot more than silly little things that divide us.
That's a good point, yeah. I watched Question Time the other night. All different parties there. There was no political arguments. They're working together on this. And then things like the supermarkets and the queuing, you got Costco near where you live, which has had ridiculous queues. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's easy to look at people and say, panic buyers, pathetic idiots. And there's a degree to which I do despair when you see people, healthy people, with family and loading their trolleys with far much more than they need. And, the toilet roll is one that's been sort of like laughed at a lot. But at the same time, I think most of these people are doing this sort of thing because they're panicking, and they're not doing it, deliberately to be malicious. They're absolutely losing their shit. And they're responding to it in the only way they know how, which is to try and make sure that them and theirs are provided for. And I just hope that once that initial surge of panic buying peaks or fades off, people begin to realise, well, I didn't need all that, and they don't do it again. So there's going to be enough to go around, and that people like your frontline medical staff and emergency service workers, and more importantly, the pensioners who live on their own, or equally importantly, are able to get what they need. So basically, I'm saying I don't join in like the ridiculing of people who've panic buyed, but I hope that it tails off very soon.
How many toilet rolls have you got?
8 in this house at the moment. 8.
Okay.
I counted them the other day.
17. I counted them.
17.
That's impressive for just me.
That is impressive. Mind you, Jacob might double the quota.
He doesn't understand rationing at the moment, so I do need to teach him. Greg, thank you. Last question. Fake news. Okay. And you were known as Bad News Greg in your day, which I'm not going to ask you about. So I've got a quiz question for you. And you need to tell me which one is fake news. Are you ready for this?
Go.
Number 1, Spotify has made playlists and a podcast for dogs to listen to. Number 2, sharks love jazz music, says Australian scientists. Number 3, an American woman with 2 nipples on her bum insures them for $10 million. Number 4, Canadian zoo owners are charged after taking their bears out for an ice cream. And number 5, a third of millennials are confused about whether the world is flat.
Right, so let's start again.
There's one which is fake news.
One of those is fake news.
One.
So the other 5 are true?
Are true. The other 4 are true. So there's Spotify podcast for dogs.
Yeah.
The second one is it's been proven, allegedly, that sharks love jazz music.
Yeah.
The third, an American woman, she's got 2 nipples on her bum and she's insured them for $10 million.
Yeah.
Number 4, some Canadian zoo owners were charged after taking bears out for ice cream.
Yeah.
And number 5,
millennials.
A third of millennials confused about whether the world is flat.
I am going to go for my fake news claim. Drum roll is the woman with 2 nipples on her bum.
That's great. Yeah, I came up with that one.
You know what? I thought you might have come up with that. It sounds like the sort of story you'd write.
No surprise. No surprise. Greg, finally, where can people find out about all the work that you do? Plug.
Follow me on Twitter at GregOK, GregOK, or the podcast that me and Adam Latham do, which is Perspectives, at Pod Perspectives on Twitter, or Perspectives Podcast on Instagram, YouTube. We've got a YouTube channel. And then if you're interested in Everton Football Club, I've got 2 podcasts on that as well, all together now. And Glad Tidings, which is via The Athletic. You can also read my stuff on The Athletic site. And that's about it, I think, for now. That's the limit of my media empire.
Greg, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on Behind the Live. You're a brilliant journalist and you've had a break in life and you've thrived ever since. I wish you all the best luck in the future. Thank you, mate.
Really enjoying the podcast, mate. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. And that was another episode of Behind the Live podcast with myself, Adam Lambert. Please give me a follow on Instagram at Behind the Live podcast, Facebook, Behind the Live podcast. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button below as well as the like button. I'll be back soon for another episode. For now, take care.